Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking Florida football on this Monday evening. We've got Graham Hall on board from the Gainesville Sun. He's also a correspondent for Gatorsports.com. First time on the show. Graham, we appreciate you coming on board.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here and talk Gators, college football. Any questions anyone may have about the program? I know that a lot's been going on different in Gainesville in the last 6 months since Jim McElwain left. So if you haven't been following up to the minute updates, we're here to answer any questions you have. So feel free to drop a comment. I'll be here for probably the next half hour talking to you. So thanks again for having me on, Mark.
Definitely. We love to keep college football alive during this, what people refer to as the dead season between the end of spring practice and when media days hit in mid to late July. But we're talking college football all the time. And Graham, let's start with the recruiting situation there in Gainesville. I saw a number of interesting reports regarding some recruits who weren't necessarily using social media in the most proper way, disrespecting Gainesville and the Florida program to a certain extent. And the one specific I heard was guys flashing the U sign. And we know that rivalry of sorts is going to be actually on the field here in a couple of years, which will be an interesting game. But what do we know about the recruiting weekend, both some of the more intriguing stuff, but the real nuts and bolts of what's happening on the recruiting path for Dan Mullen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you've been following it on social media, you'd think that Florida and Miami play every single season. That's certainly not the case, but the rivalry has not died down in the slightest. This weekend, Florida hosted what they called the inaugural Great Gator Grill Out. Every kind of head coach, when they arrive at a program, wants to do really kind of their own thing to put their stamp on that program. And that's what Dan Mullen did this weekend. Created a new event for him that was kind of just a grill out, more focused on personal relationships and just kind of having fun, which has kind of been his mantra in Gainesville, is bringing the fun back to football in Florida, which has definitely been missing probably since he's been there as Urban Meyer's offensive coordinator back in 2009. Fun really has been missing in Florida, and Dan Mullen's been trying to bring that back. It was a pretty fun event from most of the people that we talked to. Florida had a top DB come in from California. They had many top in-state prospects, many guys who are on the boards of Georgia and Alabama, and Florida getting them on campus for a brand new event coming off a 4-7 season. That alone is pretty impressive for Dan Mullen. I know they didn't get any commits, and a lot of people kind of measure success based on the amount of commitments, but all the people that Florida had on campus, pretty much, at least everyone that they're offering it as a take right now in their class, wouldn't be committing right now this early in the cycle anyway. So Florida, just to be even recruiting these guys that the last step wouldn't have been after, is pretty impressive for Dan Mullen's class. But what you referred to, Mark, was some funny drama that kind of popped off. It mainly involved Jaden Davis, Derek Wingo, a few other guys who play for South Florida Express. That's a 7-on-7 program. They were out there on campus with their coach, and they were dared by current Miami Hurricanes wide receiver Mike Harley Jr. to throw up the U on an Instagram video while they were all in Gator uniforms, all kind of in good fun. Mike was just having some fun with them. He plays for the Miami Hurricanes, but a lot of these kids go to St. Thomas Aquinas High School right now in Fort Lauderdale, and that's where Mike Harley Jr. went. So it was two guys who were kind of listening to a former teammate to throw up the U. They entertained him on a dare. He said, "You won't do it." They did it. People screenshotted it. You know, the way social media is today. I'm sure that I'm glad that I'm not growing up right now, having a Twitter account when I was 13, 14, saying things, because we all said some things like that. Jaden Davis, he's a guy with significant interest from all three Florida programs, Florida State, Florida, Miami. Every program really wants him. He's a 4-star. He is a serious take for Florida if they can get him. He's one of the kids who was throwing up the U. But the funny thing is, Florida really, really wants him, and he really, really likes Florida. So it wasn't really a sign of disrespect. He kind of had to jump out on social media yesterday, getting ahead of it and saying, "Hey, we really like the school. It was just a fun thing. It was dumb. We didn't mean to disrespect Florida. We appreciate them having us." But there are people rightfully out there, a lot of Gator fans, mainly a lot of current players, who believe that this should be a teaching tool for the kids and that Florida should stop considering them altogether. I certainly don't agree with that, because like I said, we all make mistakes on social media, made mistakes when we were 17, 16 years old. I can get why people would be up in their feelings, because Florida fans, especially on the recruiting trail in the last 2 years, feel like they've been embarrassed a little bit by Miami, even back in February, Florida thought that they were getting possibly 2 kids from American heritage, Nesta Silvera and Andrew Chapman. They ended up just getting Chatfield. Sorry, Andrew Chatfield. They ended up just getting Chatfield, but Chatfield had a Chucky doll. If you followed Florida recruiting dating back to Dante Fowler, guys before, even I think it was a tradition before him, Dominique Easley, they would have the Chucky doll. It's been a Florida thing that they've kind of prided themselves on, and a few other programs have kind of pilfered it in recent years and taken Chucky as their own symbol. Well, Nesta Silvera stood up on stage, and Florida thought that they had a good chance of flipping him, and he kind of trolled Florida with the Chucky doll. So there's been a little bit of hostility on the recruiting trail that's even picked up in the last 4 months. This seems to be just another thing. I think Jaden Davis, he's a very quiet kid, having talked to him a few times, probably has a few regrets about picking sides in this battle that is a pretty superficial battle right now, because the two teams don't even play each other really and don't really have to go through each other. Florida and LSU, Florida, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, those are much more heated battles, even Florida, Florida State, obviously. So, but all the drama on the recruiting trail seems to be between Florida and Miami. So that's the latest bit right now. Those kids apologized, but it is certainly kind of another thing that does seem kind of embarrassing for Florida's recruiting. And they kind of can't seem to avoid embarrassing moments, even in the last 12 months, I think is the real story, Mark.
Graham, I do like what you said about it being a teaching tool. I try to keep a balanced approach when it comes to these incidents. Some are more serious than others. This, not so much. It seems like you do as well in regards to, I wouldn't want my son disrespecting another university, wouldn't want him doing that. But at the same time, I understand we all did stupid things and continue to do stupid things, even into our 20s and beyond that. So people are going to make mistakes. They're going to do things in the moment. They're going to do things on a dare or be encouraged by somebody. And it's a teaching tool. I don't also think that it should just be disregarded and nothing confronted there. But maybe those people in their lives that have some influence and have some respect from them can explain to them, not just scold them, but to explain to them why they want to conduct themselves a little bit differently. And it's not the end of the world, and you move on. We got Graham Hall on the line. He's a correspondent for the Gainesville Sun and also for Gatorsports.com, covering, of course, Florida football and Florida sports overall. Don't want to overreact also, Graham, as you allude to the what is generally, if you look across the major recruiting services, about the 10th rated class in the SEC right now, headed toward 2019, 23rd in the nation. I just read up on the 247. Everybody's about in line with that, but the recruiting rankings mean what at this point? So what are you pleased with thus far? Who are some of those targets that you think could come into the fold soon?
Yeah, there's a lot of targets that Florida had on campus even this weekend that I think Florida should keep an eye on. Probably the biggest one is someone who was on campus this weekend on an unofficial visit on his own dollar coming across from California. That's Chris Steele, rated as a top 5 defensive back by most of the sites, 24/7, ESPN. They all have him up there. When you turn on the film, you see absolutely why. Florida being in the mix for this kid, a kid by all accounts didn't really grow up a fan of the Gators, just has had a strong relationship with the program. Multiple coaches have been reaching out to him since his freshman year in high school. Dan Mullen and Ron English, who has a lot of ties out there to California, he's Florida's safeties coach, have really been on this kid, and he's going to commit probably in the next 2 months. And from talking to him this week, I think it's really between Florida and Oklahoma. I know that a lot of people have USC pegged as the leader to get this kid. He's a game changer for a lot of programs. He's a kid that if you can get to commit in June, he wants to commit probably around second week of July, late June area. If you can get this kid to commit in June, any program that he goes to is going to bring a flood of talent with him. This would absolutely change Florida's recruiting if they can get someone with his profile. If they can get anyone with his profile, it would change the recruiting up to this point right now. He's that highly coveted. USC thinks that they can keep him from leaving the state, University of Southern California, but Florida really thinks that they're going to be in the mix. That's the amazing thing when you look at Florida's recruiting, Mark, is that they're in the mix for a lot of guys, 4 stars, 5 stars, who are actually seriously considering Florida, like Trey Sanders, the number 1 running back in this entire class, probably has Florida as his leader right now to this point. For a 4-7 program who came off all the embarrassing things that Florida really came off of, the embarrassing way that Jim McElwain exited the program, the death threats, the shark picture. It seems like there are countless things that recruits would not want to go to Florida for that are outside of football, besides when you look at the fact that they haven't been an offensive power and the defense has been on the field for 70% of the games for the last decade. For Florida to be getting those kids speaks to how well the staff kind of has built relationships this early. Now, what everyone's looking for and what everyone's going to judge Florida's recruiting by is how well they close. Now, a few years ago, Jim McElwain thought that they were going to get a top 8 class. They were going to get a lot of these really highly coveted prospects, and they ended up getting probably 3 of the 8 that they thought they were going to get and didn't close well on the trail. It always could go to crap at the very end of the cycle, but Florida's in a very good place right now, probably in a better place than any other program is right now. Those recruiting rankings that rank the top 25 programs right now, I would be kind of shocked if I went and looked right there and any other program that was ahead of Florida finished below 500 last year. This is a program that is 4-7, was embarrassed on many fronts last year, and they could possibly land a few 5-stars in the cycle, something they haven't done since 2012. Really, I think that Dan Mullen's done an impressive job right now. He's got a long way to go, but they've had a really good start that's been a little bit overshadowed by the fact that they're competing with Willie Taggart and Mark Ritt, who had a great season last year. So I think Florida's doing really well. Can they do better? Sure. But right now they've had a very good start. If they close as well as they've started, they're going to have a very good class.
We're on the line with Graham Hall from the Gainesville Sun and also Gators Sports. He's a correspondent there for Florida Sports. We're talking, of course, college football here. We've got the live chat fired up. A lot of comments coming in, dozens and dozens, much of it Miami rhetoric. So we won't jump to that. A lot of Miami fans on the channel here, Graham. But you mentioned Dan Mullen. And people on the chat are mentioning the quarterback situation, which is always front and center unless you've got a returning guy that's solidified and somewhat of a star. It's always going to be who's going to start at quarterback. How's the quarterback battle going? Joe Burrow was a guy that was much coveted by a few schools. Florida was talked about. He's going to LSU. How comfortable are you with the quarterback landscape? And is it Frank's in the lead, and are you pretty positive he's going to keep the lead and be the game one guy?
Well, I think Florida certainly has to go after a grad transfer QB. I think that is absolutely a certainty, mainly from the fact, even if they had a quarterback battle that was settled, if they knew who was going to be the starter, you can't go into SEC football running the offense that Dan Mullen wants to run and have only 3 healthy QBs on the roster. Florida has seen how bad that can be when you really don't have a proven talent on the roster and your numbers kind of dwindle. Florida played 3 QBs 2 seasons ago, Luke Del Rio, Trayon Harris, Austin Appleby. They certainly don't want to repeat a scenario where they're throwing a guy without experience into the fire because they don't have another healthy QB on the roster. They have the roster spots where they can add another grad transfer. I think that they go and get the guy who just left Clemson, Hunter, starts with a B. I can't remember him off the top of my head. I think that he's a kid who would be very good in the locker room as a backup option, has game experience, a former 5-star prospect, a lot of potential right there for Florida. Missing on Joe Burrow, I don't know how much interest they really had with Joe Burrow. He was a hot topic, certainly throughout the spring as we discussed possible options, possibly seeing another QB leave, which did happen at Florida when Jake Allen announced that he was transferring after spring. We thought that Joe Burrow would be a name that'd be kicked around regardless because it was pretty clear throughout spring that no QB, whether it was Felipe Franks or Kyle Trask, was going to emerge as the starting quarterback, and that's really where Florida is right now. They don't have a clear-cut quarterback. They're not ready to hand first-string reps to some guy right when fall camp opens, so it's going to be another battle, which is going to kind of set back the install of the entire offense, having that position unsettled. So I think that Florida will look to add another guy, a guy who has some experience where the learning curve is a little bit smaller than maybe Felipe Franks's and certainly Kyle Trask's. I think, like, to answer your question, that Felipe Franks is still the leader to be Florida's starting quarterback heading into fall camp and heading into the season, based purely on having game experience. The only quarterback on that roster who has played in an SEC game, has played in a college game. Kyle Trask had a great spring, had a great spring even the year before, but the fact of the matter is he was a backup in high school to a guy who was ranked as a 5-star athlete, went to Houston, but Kyle Trask has not started a game at quarterback since he was a freshman in high school, and it was the JV team. I think that Florida's not going to hand the reins to Emory Jones either, because when you look at everything Dan Mullen did at Mississippi State, the 9 years that he was there, even the hesitance when they had a 5-star quarterback named Tim Tebow and Chris Leak was kind of being soured on by the fan base at Florida, Dan Mullen really does not want to throw a freshman QB into the fire. I don't think he's going to throw Emory Jones into the fire, which makes me think that the only option is they take a grad transfer QB who's more ahead of where they even think he's going to be, or it's Felipe Franks, and then they hope that he can lead the offense and the rest of the offenses can be tooled around his skill set so that he's not going to have to win the game by throwing 63-yard bombs at the end of the fourth quarter against Tennessee. So I think that really the big thing for Florida is finding some guy who can manage the offense. I don't think he's on the roster right now, though.
We got Graham Hall on the line. You can catch him as a correspondent for the Gainesville Sun and also Gator Sports, covering Florida football and athletics across the board. This is Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please subscribe here. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry on a daily basis. And we are going to Gainesville to talk nothing but Gators here. We've got a ton of comments on the line, but not necessarily anything of note. No disrespect to the chat line here, but a lot of trash talking among themselves, and I enjoy it off to the side.
That's why we love college football. That's why we all love college football.
Yes, absolutely. So if anybody has any specific comments or questions for Graham, please leave them there, and I will try to find them within the chat. You mentioned a number of times the name of Dan Mullen, and you did it so in a positive tone. I thought it was a great hire. I just thought from the standpoint of, you mentioned the embarrassment that the Jim McElwain tenure ended in. Will Muschamp, to a certain extent, in certain spots, although he's certainly resurrecting his image in Columbia, South Carolina. From an offensive standpoint, it's been basically an embarrassment since Urban Meyer left campus. But Dan Mullen, just from the standpoint of football acumen, ties to the program, and just respect as being a solid guy who's going to do things the right way, seems to be the guy, the fit for this job.
Yeah, he's absolutely struck every single right chord since he's hopped off that plane at the end of November there. Dan Mullen, I think he takes a lot of his confidence knowing that the last person who was successful on offense in Gainesville was him. I think that he knows how to lead this program. There are certain things about Gainesville. Every college town out there has a few peculiar aspects about living amongst the community, and Dan Mullen has been very frank about how hard it was living in Gainesville for those 4 years with Meyer, and how hard it would be for him to return. He talked a lot about how his wife, who worked for the Golf Channel in Orlando, would get groceries in Orlando after she left work and drove back up to Gainesville, because if they didn't score 40 points, like he likes to say, he would get looks in the grocery store. And now he's got 2 kids. And I think that he's certainly the right guy for the job, because he knows the expectations better than any other coach coming into Gainesville doing the job, because there is certainly a learning curve. We saw that with Jim McElwain. He never was very, very comfortable, never fully comfortable in Gainesville. He would reminisce a lot, talk about being back in Montana, how much he liked the West Coast, how much he liked Colorado, how he did things differently in Alabama. With Dan Mullen, when he reminisces, it's good things about Mississippi State, but it's all about what he did at Florida back then and how he's grown from that. And that certainly has struck a lot of Florida fans. That's, like I said, has struck the right chord amongst Florida fans who really kind of have had, like I said, 8 years of 2 coaches who never really looked fully comfortable in Gainesville, and definitely didn't bring the program back to the levels that it had been at before in the last decade. But Dan Mullen is a guy who actually understands that. So I think he's done a very, very good job at changing the vibe around the program, reconnecting with the fan base, connecting with a fan base that had kind of had a disconnect with the administration and the athletic department. When a program's not winning, they don't like going out to the fans. They don't like talking to the fans. They don't like saying, we're going to do this. They don't like making promises that they can't keep. Dan Mullen has a clean slate. He hasn't lost yet as head coach, so he has certainly made a very, very strong impression promising all these things, and he knows that he's going to have to back it up. I think the reason people in Gainesville have bought in on him already is because he's already proven it. Any other coach would be facing probably a little more wave of scrutiny, saying all the things that he has since arriving in Gainesville. It's been certainly a lot of confidence. Another thing that I think a lot of people have said that's kind of fallen by the wayside, it's a very interesting thing, is the whole Scott Strickland equation. Florida's athletic director, like Mullen, was at Mississippi State before he was hired away by Florida. There is this rivalry that seems to exist between Mississippi State and Florida now. And then there's also these certain contingent of Gator fans that think that Scott Strickland initially took the easy way out in hiring Dan Mullen, because of the whole coaching search was very public. First they were talking to Mike Norvell, then the whole Chip Kelly thing that was seemingly in the headlines every single day before he went to UCLA. There was a certain contingency that Florida thinks that Scott Strickland took the easy way out and hired his buddy Dan Mullen because he knew what he was getting. He wasn't a risk. But I think that hiring Dan Mullen was the biggest risk that Scott Strickland could take because he ultimately tied his legacy to Dan Mullen. If Dan Mullen's not successful in Florida, certainly within the first 2-3 years, there's going to be people who are going to criticize, rightfully so, Scott Strickland's legacy in Gainesville, especially after the shadow that Jeremy Foldy left. So Dan Mullen, there's a lot of pressure on him to succeed. A lot of other people's careers are tied to his success. So far, he said all the right things, but there's a lot more pressure, I think, on his plate than there was on Jim McElwain's upon arriving in Gainesville, because there was a lot of people in Gainesville who thought that any positive on offense is going to be an improvement for Florida because they didn't think the defense was going to drop off. Jim McElwain certainly had that window, but there's a lot of people in Gainesville, I think, that are expecting Dan Mullen to come out and instantly return Florida's offense to the level that it was under when he was here with Urban Meyer, and that's simply not going to be the case. So I'm very intrigued to see how the season's going to play out because Florida's certainly going to struggle at some points. And this is a fan base that is known to kind of souring on a coach very, very quickly. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what kind of leash Dan Mullen has in Gainesville. But it's a guy who's certainly said all the right things to date, but it's all about those 60 minutes on the field, Mark.
Now, fortunately for us, for college football fans, the division rotation on the schedule means that it only comes up one time aside from the rival that you play in the other division, only once out of every 6 years. And it comes up perfectly after this hire that Mississippi State and Florida meet on the football field here in 2018. Speaking of which, Graham, scheduling. So I'm big into scheduling. College football fans big into scheduling, and they get excited when they hear that Notre Dame and Alabama are going to play, or Alabama and Texas, or whatever the matchup is. I did a series in which I tried to fix SEC scheduling, so we don't need to get into that. But I also looked at the future schedules of the SEC. And in looking at Florida, it strikes me as rather interesting. Maybe you can have some level of insight into this, that if you look across college football, regardless of the status of the program, they have scheduled most of their slots are full non-conference close to the end of the 2020s decade, like 2030. Look at Florida here. And I think the 18 schedule is a fair one out of conference. So they always play Florida State. So they're going to face typically one of the top 10 or 15 best teams in the country. Not necessarily last year, but typically. And they got Charleston Southern, Colorado State, and Idaho. Then past there, the game that everybody's talking about in the chat, the Miami game in Orlando. Other than that, Florida State's only scheduled through 2020. I would think that that's just going to be automatically be extended. But besides that, completely open past 2020. No game. Samford's there at 2021. But in terms of Power 5 big game opponents, like it's wide open.
Yeah, I think that Florida has struggled with that balance over the years of wanting to create a strong schedule, but not one that's going to cripple the program. I know that Alabama in recent years has played Ohio State to open the season. Florida certainly was embarrassed at the hands of Michigan in Cowboy Stadium to open the season last year. That was a game that was scheduled all the way back in 2012, took 5 years for it to take effect. So they could be scheduling games right now to kind of pad that schedule a little bit more. I think that Florida's mentality has always been, though, that they play Florida State, maybe play Miami, and then let the SEC schedule battle them out while they try and pad the slate with two other non-conference opponents like an Idaho or a Presbyterian, which has seemingly been a program that's been around here a lot in the last 2 decades. I think that Florida should benefit a little bit more, especially on the recruiting trail, by maybe scheduling some opponents where they actually want to target growing their recruiting base. And I think that's going to be up north. I think that Florida has to, as recruiting extends up and the north honestly gets better at developing football prospects, I think that Florida is going to start scheduling games up north. I would not be surprised if they did a home and home series with Ohio State. But right now, Scott Strickland, his priority right now is keeping that Florida State rivalry alive, rescheduling some Miami games. But it certainly is a fair point of criticism that they don't play the best non-conference schedule outside of FSU. And if FSU has a bad season, Florida does kind of skate by. And that's what is kind of happening this year. They're lucky because of the whole hurricane fiasco of 2 years ago that they're going to have LSU be here in Gainesville again. And then you look at the rest of the schedule, it could easily be a 5-0 start for Florida, and they could easily go 8 wins this year and double their win total. The schedule is that favorable. Now, that certainly is a benefit when you're trying to turn around a program who went 4-7. But if this team becomes the team that Dan Mullen thinks that they're going to be, they certainly can't get by playing the Colorado States and the Charleston Southerns in the first 2 weeks of the schedule, or they're not going to be able to get those points in the rankings that they would like. So certainly kind of an interesting balance that they have to strike. And I think that Florida is going to announce a few series in the next few years, but right now it's just Florida State for them right now. And I know that there's a large contingent of people that rightfully criticize them for that and say that they kind of escape while Alabama gets beat up by Ohio State and plays a much, much tougher SEC West division.
Enjoying the conversation with Graham Hall. You can catch him on the Gainesville Sun and also Gatorsports.com. I see a couple interesting articles right there on the front page at Gatorsports.com. So join him right there for the very best in Florida football and athletics coverage. Before we let you go, Graham, and we would love to have you back a number of times throughout the summer as we get set for August. We want to break down all the positions we can possibly get to for all the major teams and even beyond that. But if you can give us a sneak peek, a glimpse into your thinking in regards to maybe a position that you are really going to be tracking once we hit August, that maybe beyond the quarterback position, as everybody's eyeing that, has you intrigued for one reason or another.
I'll give you a quick one on offense and defense. If Florida can get the quarterback situation figured out, whereas then they even have a quarterback who is solid on offense, not amazing. They're not trying to get a guy who's going to be, Jalen Hurts and lead an offense well. Actually, Jalen Hurts is a good example of a guy who's a good game manager. If Florida can get a good game manager at quarterback, the wide receiver core is probably the best Florida has had since the early 2000s, those Rex Grossman teams. Tyree Cleveland, Trevon Grimes. You look at all those guys, Van Jefferson, their recruiting profiles are higher than any guys Florida has had on campus. Right now, the big storyline for Florida going on, a lot of fans have been following it every single day, is are Van Jefferson going to be and Trevon Grimes going to be cleared by the NCAA to be able to play immediately for Florida? Losing Antonio Callaway gives them just one surefire dynamic wide receiver. That's Tyree Cleveland, and he missed all spring being injured. So if they don't get these two guys, the two transfers cleared, that room could look night and day when it comes to potential. That's certainly one to watch right now as that unfolds in the summer. And if they get a quarterback, that's certainly going to be the key to having a very good offense, well, a much better improved offense. And then the big one is linebacker on defense. The big one that they got back is David Reese, but outside of that, they have no depth at the position, and that could kill you, especially a team like Florida who's switching to 3-4 and needs some outside linebackers to kind of step it up. David Reese, the only guy really who stepped up. Florida signed 4 linebackers in the 2017 class. None of them saw the field last year. That's embarrassing. 2 of them were caught up in the credit card fraud scandal. One of them tore his Achilles, and one wasn't good enough to see the field all season. Florida needs to have some depth at the position, or they're going to get thrown for 300 yards a game on that defense every single game. So those 2 questions need to be figured out. Those guys need to work hard in summer camp. Spring looked much improved at the position with Ventrell Miller and James Houston, the guys who missed for the credit card fraud scandal. Those are certainly going to be a battle that's going to play out in fall, because if they have any depth at that position, that was probably the weakest spot of that defense last year, a defense that was very, very good at every other position. So that's a question that I think that they're going to look to get answered, and that wide receiver core could end up being one of the best in the SEC if they have a quarterback.
And it's a great point about the defense, because I think the defense gets dismissed as a given. This is going to be a really good defense. It's always a good defense. The offense has been horrible now for what seems forever, and the focus is always like, we got to fix the offense. And those Will Muschamp defenses going into the McElwain era, the only reason they stayed within a score or 2 of Alabama in some of those SEC championship games is because the defense was ridiculously good, top 5 in the nation. I don't care what the statistics said, but it seems to have dropped off a little bit the last couple years, and it seems to be kind of slipping. And I would say going back to 2012, that Muschamp defense against maybe the best schedule in the country was ridiculously good when they just barely lost in a tiebreaker the SEC Eastern Division. But is there a little slippage there with the defense possibly?
I think that it's possible. I know that there are some very promising bright spots. There are 2 defensive backs who were freshmen last year, Marco Wilson and CJ Henderson, going to be in for a big year, or maybe they were sophomores last year. I have to go back and look. But those guys are going to be certainly the leaders of a secondary that didn't lose too much talent, lost 2 guys. Duke Dawson to the second round of the NFL draft. Marcel Harris had missed all last year. They got some questions at safety they're going to have to answer. But across the board, it looks like that they could retool, but a lot of unproven talent. The big word to use, obviously, is potential. A lot of guys that you think are going to step up this year, but they haven't done it, so there's no point in banking on it. I think that's the big thing for Florida. But when we talked a lot about offensive potential, I think you brought up a good point about that 2012 Will Muschamp offense, about how the defense was so good, but the offense wasn't there to get them over any type of hump that they possibly could get over. The reason people are, I think, really bought into Dan Mullen right now is because he's done a lot with a lot less. Dak Prescott, Nick Fitzgerald, 3-star quarterback guys who ended up being 5-star guys in the SEC. That's very, very promising for Florida. Will Muschamp couldn't turn 2 5-star QBs in Jacoby Brissett and Jeff Driscoll into a sensible SEC quarterback outside of practice. And Dan Mullen has done it with 3-star guys. I think that a lot of people think that Dan Mullen could save Felipe Franks' potential. And that's what I think is the key to Florida's offense being good, is having him, because he has all the physical tools in the world. And I think that's the biggest question. If they can have him be a sensible quarterback, Florida's going to win 8 games next year. And that's night and day of a 4-17.
And that has to be the bottom line big disappointment from the Jim McElwain tenure, is that he comes in with an accomplished track record as a quarterback guy, an offensive guy that didn't necessarily find the right guy. Maybe he didn't make the best selection of quarterbacks, or you would think with 4 or 5 to choose from that he would make that right selection, knowing what he knows, and then he would be able to develop them through the spring and through the fall to be ready to take on an SEC schedule. And that just never came to fruition at all.
I got to remind you of what Florida fans can't forget, the Will Grier fiasco, where Jim McElwain thought that he had a lot of, I don't want to say if it's clout, but Will Grier clearly is one of the best returning quarterbacks in college football right now. And Jim McElwain said, I can't guarantee that you're going to be the starter. If he couldn't identify that this guy was going to be one of the best in college football, I don't think that Florida fans really want him around for another season. The last point I'm going to make to you, Mark, about Jim McElwain is everyone knows that, you build your career on one thing, and if you're really good at it, you stick with it. Jim McElwain won national championships at Alabama while doing what? Calling plays as the offensive coordinator. He goes to Colorado State, calls plays for 1 season. After that, hands off play calling duties. Comes to Florida, coaches the SEC, never calls plays once, hands it to Doug Nussmeier. If you make your career off one thing, and that's calling plays, and Nick Saban trusts you to do it, why give that away when you reach the pinnacle of the profession, coaching an SEC program at 45 years old? That I never understood. And Dan Mullen coming in immediately and saying, I'm going to coach call my own plays, has got to be a huge sigh of relief for Florida fans.
All right. He is a wealth of knowledge and insight covering Florida football. We've got Graham Hall on the line. And please join him on Twitter, and also his work at the Gainesville Sun and Gatorsports.com covering Florida athletics. And, of course, we talk football all the time. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for the very best in college football analysis right here. If you enjoy the audio versions instead, Google Play, Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher, just search Mark Rogers TV. Graham, first time on Mark Rogers TV. I appreciate you accepting the offer, and you're welcome back anytime.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Mark. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody out there, for your questions.